What's up, y'all? Ryan here, and welcome back to the channel. Today I have something a little bit different for you all. I'm sure there's plenty of Sakazuki deck techs all over the internet, and great ones with good advice and decent gameplay, but what I wanted to do is kind of cover basically every individual card that Sakazuki could possibly run, and go over their strengths and weaknesses, and help you decide what suits both your playstyle and your local meta, or what you want to represent at regionals, treasure cups, nationals, and help you fix those numbers, because one of Sakazuki's greatest weaknesses in deck building is that he has too many options. You can't just play 4 of every good card, unfortunately. You'd be well over 50 cards, you'd probably be close to 80 or 90, and so you have to make really strong decisions on what you're going to be playing in those flex slots. I do believe there are some definitive cards that you absolutely have to run at 4, and I'm going to go over those. But other than that, I want to help you fill in those curves with things that suit your playstyle, suit your local meta, suit the kind of game plan that you want to enact. So without further ado, let's get into it. So firstly, I wanted to go over the cards that I think should always be 4-ofs in the deck. There's probably a couple of exceptions to these, but just in general, I think it's the best starting place. And if you look at 99% of the decks out there that are topping regionals, they'll probably have all of these at 4-ofs. So I don't want to spend too much time on these because everyone probably knows their power level, but you'll bear with me. Let's go over them one by one, and if you think you already know their power level, you can go ahead and skip ahead to the flex plots. So first we're going to talk about Brand New. He's one of the linchpins of the deck. He's probably the best early game play that you have. He helps you fill the trash, theoretically sculpt your hand and make it more well-rounded, or find the missing pieces. For example, if you're missing reducers, or short on removal, or short on counterpower, he can help you find all 3. And most importantly, another card that you'll find in this 4-of list is Houndblaze, and he's one of your best early game targets for it, in a sense of enacting Sakazuki's game plan, which in my opinion, Sakazuki's game plan is to both control the board while being proactive. So removing a character while getting a high attack in, taking a life, getting cards out of their hand, or producing a threat. And that's why cards like Brand New paired with Houndblaze are so pivotal to the deck. In addition to a lot of other synergies and combos that we'll go over later. Now the next card on this list, if you've been playing any OP05, I'm sure you know how strong it is. Rebecca, the second linchpin of the deck. Out of all cards that you should consider while deck building, synergizing with her in particular, and Brand New is probably the most important. Her ability to recur cards from the trash allows us to be extremely proactive and even greedy with our leader effect. For example, pitching 2Ks on turn 1 because they have little impact towards our game plan, and even though we don't want to be light on counter, Rebecca being able to get them back later on is one of the reasons we're able to do that. She synergizes in a way that not only allows but encourages us to use our leader effect from the very start of the game every turn, which is really important because we want to be filling our trash for cards like Rob Lucci and for her as well. She allows for both defensive and offensive plays and combos, like establishing herself as a blocker while also deploying a threat like 3-cost Hina, or recurring removal like Lucci so that you can reuse it, or even defensive options like getting back a 2K or getting back a Borsellino or Sabo and then replaying them. This card can really do everything, and you can even grab a utility card that you're planning on using later while putting in a different card from your hand, like Brand New or Sudu. Next is Sudu. So Sudu's the most Dawn-efficient cost reduction possible besides Great Eruption, which later in the video you'll also see is at 4. But it's also versatile. It's a 2K, so it means it gives us some defensive power, as well as the ability to put it in off of Rebecca, the combo that defensive playstyle of putting up a blocker while also cost reducing. And she's also searchable off Brand New, which is just icing on the cake. Next is Tashigi. She's also searchable off Brand New, a repeatable cost reducer, albeit harder to use more than once, a defensive 2K, and most importantly, recurable off of Rebecca. allowing us to not regret countering early or trashing to leader effect. So next we're going to go over Houndblaze. It's one of the most broken cards of the deck. It pairs well with Brand New Early, which is one of our only and best early game plays. It's searchable removal off Brand New, and it fits the Sakazuki game plan of controlling the opponent's board in a proactive manner very well. It's not using your Dawn to remove a character and then getting a weak attack in, it's using your Dawn to remove a character and still getting a powerful attack in, whether it's at their board or at their life, which will always either get us closer to ending the game or cards out of their hand, which in turn is the same thing. Next, we're going to talk about Great Eruption, an extremely great card in Sakazuki, really broken. It's the most efficient cost reduction available per Dawn invested that also allows you to draw towards action, missing pieces like counter, KO power, or reducers, or just key cards in your certain matchups. For example, if you're digging towards your 10 cost Kaido in the NL matchup, cards like Great Eruption and other card draw cards that we're going to talk about later in the video all help you dig towards that Kaido if you didn't start with it in your opening hand. So the next couple of cards, in my opinion, should always be at 4, but they definitely teeter the line. I've seen lists that run, up to 3, usually never less than 3. And while I don't personally agree with it, obviously, the goal of this video is to get a Sakazuki deck that fits your playstyle. So if you do decide to cut any cards from 4 to 3, these next 3 are probably going to be them. First, let's talk about Rob Lucci. He's extremely efficient removal, most importantly with no built-in card disadvantage. If you've been playing since set 2 or 3 and you were playing black, you knew most of your removal came at a cost, mostly discarding a card. And in fact, Lucci is actually card advantage, trading 2 for 1 if you're able to KO 2 things. And one of his greatest strengths is in matchups where they play 1-cost searchers. It allows you the ability to not have to ignore them, to where they could actually become threats in the late game with 10 Dawn available to your opponent, where they can start attacking like for 7 with a Pudding or an Izo. And you get to just incidentally remove those without having to have invested, a KO card or an attack into them. So it's a really powerful card, one of the best in the deck, and unfortunately it's not searchable, so in matchups where you feel like it's absolutely crucial, you want to mulligan aggressively for it, as well as always consider that your brand news will mill them, so opening like 2 brand news and playing them both off the bat runs the risk of putting them into the discard. But also importantly, never forget that Rebecca can get him back, even though she can't put him into play off her second ability. She can always bring him back from the discard pile, play a cost reducer from hand, and then play Lucci for 4 Dawn. Next, we're going to talk about the starter deck Hina, the 3-cost 5k that on play reduces a character's cost by 4. This card's a really broken combo piece. It's extremely aggressively costed and pairs perfectly with all of your removal. For example, you can spend 5 Dawn to remove a cost 6 through 7 character with just Houndblaze, Hina, and maybe your leader effect. The things it can do with Rebecca, for example, putting in Rebecca, playing Hina, attacking with leader, and then playing Rob Lucci to KO maybe a 5 and a 3, is extremely cost efficient. There's pretty much no end to the amount of synergies Hina has in the deck, and eventually you can just figure them all out by playing. I think the most notable one is it's always tempting to discard your Hinas to leader effect because you want to do the Rebecca combo, but if you're in a matchup where you need to deal with a 9-cost, for example, Yamato or Edward Newgate, make sure you remember that your later attack plus hard playing Hina for 3 Dawn and then hard playing Borsellino for 7 Dawn gets rid of any 9 and below. You can't make that play with Rebecca because then you won't be able to play the Borsellino, as they're 11 Dawn total. So always keep that in mind, just in case. Lastly, this is the most arguable one as if it should be a 4 or not, but personally I can't imagine going less than 4, mainly because of the upsides that it brings when playing certain matchups, especially the ones I think are some of the hardest. I'm talking about Borsellino, the 4-cost blocker. He's a free block against tap-out turns from 5k leaders, for example if they're tapping out for starter deck Charlotte Lin or Katakuri or Yamato, and want to get an attack in with leader. Borsellino basically just stops that right in its tracks and saves you a life. Most importantly, in the meta triangle of Purple Leafy, Sakazuki, and Enel, Borsellino as a 4-Don play punishes the best follow-up plays that Enel and Purple Leafy could have, which would be Poly and Gadatsu. Establishing it early enables cards like 10-cost Kaido to be played without a fear of dying from tapping out all 10 Don, and he also protects other characters really well. For example, if you're ahead, Borsellino can protect cards like Manchetti, Hina, or even Brand New from being KO'd by leader if they still want to greedily tap out to play their big aggressive creature. In the mirror, he even demands a Borsellino in response, the 7-cost or Houndblaze, otherwise he can't be removed, which is also a huge plus. Next up, I want to talk about the majority of the best cards that fit in the flex spots to round out your deck, aside from those 4-ofs that I talked about in the previous section. These cards you'll probably see in different deck lists in any number from 0 to 3, and I want to go over the strengths and weaknesses of each one individually so that you can try and better decide what you want to be doing when you're building your deck, because you definitely can't fit all of these and you definitely can't fit them at high numbers. And I'll try and explain why. Essentially, when building Sakazuki, a couple of the things you have to consider are how many Navy cards am I running versus how many non-Navy cards, because we don't want our brand news to be missing, especially since it's our almost only early play, and if it doesn't get us that card, we're immediately down a card with very little board presence. Secondly, we want to be considerate of how much cards with no counter we have. Sakazuki doesn't play event cards that provide counter on defense, and the only reason we're able to run such a high density of no counter cards that are very powerful is because of our leader effect. Being able to discard cards with no counter early in the game to find the ones that do have counter allows us to play both aggressively and defensively while also playing an extremely powerful core of cards with no counter. One of the other considerations that you have is cards that synergize well with Rebecca, or cards that help you play on the play, meaning you have the first turn of the game, because Sakazuki almost always wants to go second, but having cards that help you when you lose the die roll and don't have a choice to go second is an important thing to consider when deck building with him. So first up, let's talk about Mancherry. Mancherry is an extremely powerful late game card. One of the most busted things about her is that she allows you to get back Rebecca, which Rebecca allows you to get back other things like Sabo and Borsellino and 2k counters. So in stale board states or slowed down games, especially in mirrors, cards like this can really get you back ahead in card advantage by playing a bunch of 2-for-1s, including herself. She also recurs Rob Lucci, which is really important when you find yourself low on removal. I currently run her at 2. I've tried versions of her at 1, but the biggest weakness of her at 1 is if you ever need to discard her early or leader effect or counter with her early, then you'll never have another one again, which can be scary, but it's definitely doable. I won plenty of games without needing Mancherry, and most importantly, I'd say don't become reliant on her. You don't necessarily want to go to the late game every game with Sakazuki, but you do have a very powerful one, so Mancherry is just a good card to make you feel comfortable when you get there. Next is One-Legged Soldier. This card is an extremely powerful cost reducer. It synergizes pretty well with other cards that we have in the deck because it fills up our trash and isn't a card that we can get off Rebecca, so sending it back to the bottom of our deck with cards like Lucci or Mancherry is pretty simple to do. It's also a 2k counter, obviously, which makes it a really good defensive tool. It is non-Navy, meaning it can't be searched off brand new, and adds to the amount of non-Navy cards you have, which is something I mentioned that you always want to consider. I have some friends that are very high on it and run it at 4. I usually like it at 2 to 3, maybe even 1, but in any case, definitely worth considering, especially if you like a more defensive playstyle or if you want more efficient cost reducers. Next up is Bartolomeo, a very versatile 2k counter. He's also a blocker, which is a really insane defensive card to just have been printed and to exist. It's a not Navy, which is very important to consider. If you do run it, usually you only want it at 1 or 2. And remember to always keep considering the amount of non-Navy you have. But it's extremely versatile. Its weakness is definitely removal. You don't want to play this in the late game versus like Enel when they're about to slam their Yamatos and stuff. But you can combo it with Sabo to establish a really defensive line that can't be KO'd on certain turns. And of course, the main reason to run it over other blockers or other 2Ks is because it's recurable off Rebecca. Next is Kobe, an extremely interesting pet card. I wouldn't personally play more than 2 of it because he has something that Sakazuki can't really afford, which is card disadvantage. He does require discarding a card to KO something, but his range is a lot higher than our usual removal. He's very aggressively costed, only costing 3 Don to KO something, and most importantly, he's searchable and recurable and playable off of Rebecca. So it's a very interesting tech card, running maybe like a 1 of Silver Bullet to get you up to that 12th or 13th removal piece while also still having counter. He's an interesting card. If you feel like you haven't been KOing enough of your opponent's characters, definitely worth considering teching 1 or 2 of them. Next is Ulti. Ulti is an extremely powerful card when paired with cost reducers. Honestly, extremely broken. I wouldn't recommend playing Ulti in the current meta, mostly because, as great of a 3 Don play that she is, she dies to almost all the removal in the format, and it's very rare that she'll stick. However, if your meta is a bunch of non-removal decks like Red Purple Luffy or Whitebeard, she is an absolute house in those, and if you want to just tech her for locals where your maybe best players are on those decks or decks that are low on removal, she's definitely one of your go-tos. Ulti also has the added benefit of when your opponent doesn't have a board and there's nothing to remove or put on the bottom, she can bounce characters like Branu or UK counters that you've played previously like Sudu back to your hand. Next up is the 3-cost Hina from OP05. This card caused a lot of controversy in my local meta. There were some people in favor of it and some people who thought it was absolute garbage. I wasn't convinced myself, and I needed to try it out just to see, and I definitely see its merit. I learned very quickly how good having a play on 3 Dawn is, and especially one that draws you a card. It's absolutely insane, honestly. It's such a good tempo advantage. The problem is, at least that I have personally with Hina, is that it's really only good ever on 3 Dawn. If it's past your 3 Dawn turn, you almost never wanting to be play it. You might not even have 5 cards, you might have taken the first hit and now you're at 6 or 7. So I found, unless you find yourself losing pretty much every die roll, Hina's not really worth playing. Although, I will say, I personally lose plenty of die rolls and I still don't play it. There's another card I'm going to talk about in just a second that I think is just a better option for when you're forced to play on the odd curve. But if you like Hina and if you want it in your opening hand and you're not drawing your brand news, Hina is actually definitely a great card, especially to establish early against every matchup that you have, because it just gives you that 1 extra card to play with and a threat and gets you closer to the impactful cards. Next up is 4-cost Kuzan, an absolute house of a card. You won't really find any lists that run less than 2 of it. I personally run 3 because I love having cards that draw me towards the cards I want in certain matchups, and it's also a really easy card to pitch to leader effect as long as I know I'm never going to be using its when attacking effect. So it doesn't take much explanation. Its when attacking effect to reduce 4 is absolutely busted, basically enables every single one of your removal spells, and its ability to draw a card when you play it is unmatched. It's just so nice to not be down in cards when you're playing black or when you're playing blue, and especially the upside of when they don't remove it, because make no mistake, Kuzan will have probably the biggest target on his head of any card in your deck, but when they don't answer it, the amount of tempo that you're able to accumulate because of it is just insane. So if you want to be crazy like me and run 3, I don't think it's that crazy. So next up is Sabo. And Sabo is the card I was referring to earlier that when you're being forced to play on the odd curve a lot, I love. Sabo fills up your graveyard, sculpts your hand, provides you a blocker, and most importantly in the late game when you have Pendant to utilize and you play multiple threats followed by Sabo, usually your opponent will have gone through in the mirror at least some amount of bottom decking, like 2 Hound Blazes or maybe a Borsalino, maybe a Mihawk, and establishing that Sabo so that they can't Lucci your 2 things is actually really insane in the mirror. I also just think its 6k body is really relevant. One of the things that I forgot to mention when I was talking about Borsalino and why I love him is because when you're ahead, one of the things Sakazuki can do is attack with its blockers. And that's why you play cards like Borsalino and not cards like Fukuro, because Borsalino can attack leaders still. So it's still an aggressive card. And Sabo, he takes that to the next level because with 1 Dawn, he gets to attack for that 7k sweet spot. And he's also still harder to KO on the crackback, the same way Borsalino is. But on your turn, he still attacks for 6, even without Dawn. So I just love Sabo. I think he's a really great card. I run him at 2. I would run more, but like I mentioned in the beginning of this segment, you have to be careful when choosing the non-navy cards that you're choosing to run. And I think 2 is a sweet spot for Sabo. And he has counter on top of everything. Absolutely broken card. So next up is the 7-cost Borsalino. This card is really great. It's really well statted. I mean, as I'm sure you all know, a 7 for 8, something that's really, really nice, like to play on curve. And hitting 4 or less is actually really strong in most matchups, especially he needs little assistance in the current meta to hit most relevant things. And he's going to be one of your best answers to pair with things like Great Eruption and Leader Effect or Hina to hit those boss monsters that your opponent's going to be laying down while establishing one of your own. Also, the fact that he bottom decks, meaning he can get around things like Sabo and Borsalino, is really nice. The only reason he's not a 4 of is because he's really not the best in every matchup. Sometimes you don't want to play more than 1 or 2 down, or rather you don't have the luxury to. 7 Dawn is an extreme Dawn investment, and if you're already behind and tapping out 7 Dawn instead of, for example, playing a Houndblaze plus blocker, you might actually just get beat out by some aggression that your opponent can maintain even though you established your boss monster. So playing him at the right time is really important. An easy card to pitch the Leader Effect early in the game, unless like he's absolutely vital to your game plan or maybe he's the only piece of removal in your hand. But just a great card. If you want to run it at 4, go for it. It's searchable off brand new, which is a good reason that you can keep it at 3. And considering all those things, just try and find the right amount for you. Next up is Dracul Mihawk, and he basically has the majority of the same things going for him as Borsalino, with a little bit higher of an upside. He requires less help to tuck more relevant things like 7-cost Big Mom or 8-cost Katakuri if you got to attack with your leader. So he's a really powerful play, and notably on 10 Dawn, he can remove anything with the help of Great Eruption plus Leader Effect plus himself. It's still 10 Dawn that you can use, 3 cost reduction, and he tucks a 7 or less. So a really powerful card, really great stat line. The only thing is, again, he's not Navy, so he's not searchable. So running him both increases the count of cards that you have that are not Navy and makes your brand news a little bit worse by putting one of your removal cards into the trash if it ever reveals it. I don't know where or how people find the room for him, but if you figure that you like him or figure that he's best thing for your local meta, then by all means he's a really, really powerful card to be running. Next up is 10-cost Kaido, a card that I believe, in my honest opinion, is somewhat essential in the current meta, mostly just because of the Enel matchup. Enel is a really annoying, really powerful strategy, specifically against our deck, where even if we are controlling their board, they're still extremely hard to KO because the majority of our boards are always going to be like a couple of 5Ks, 4-costed characters that invest a lot of Dawn to make sure that they hit through Enel's like big hands. And Kaido does double duty against the Enel matchup where he's a 12k body that basically they'll never counter out of if it's attacking their life. And more importantly, Kaido dissuades their boss monsters from attacking because for just 1 Dawn we can attack back into their Yamatos and it would cost them 3 cards to save them. And even if they did make that play after attacking, we'd still have 9 Dawn to work with to try and reduce Yamato and KO it ourselves. So considering a turn like that, where we would have gotten 3 cards out of our opponent's hand, KO'd their boss monster, and left a boss monster of our own to be dealt with on their turn, which probably they can't deal with. It's just an insane card. You can definitely beat Enel without it, and if you just can't find the room or can't find the Kaidos, it's totally fine to build a Sakazuki deck without them, but I just think it makes that particular matchup a lot easier. And I also built my deck in a way that has a little bit more card draw in it than other versions so that I can try and dig toward these Kaidos to make that game just so much less stressful and really not play Enel's game of going to the super late game where their board is just 3 Yamatos, a Katakuri, and Sanji blockers and a bunch of threatening triggers off life where I can't win. Next up is Ice Age. Now Ice Age is a really interesting card. It's honestly really broken, the fact that it reduces 5 for 1 This entire time I've been talking about how Pseudo and Great Eruption are the most efficient cost reducers, but I totally disregarded Ice Age, and Ice Age reducing 5 for just 1 Dawn is absolutely insane. The most important thing to consider though is that it is card disadvantage. Ice Age on its own doesn't do anything. It reduces the cost of 5, but it doesn't draw you a card like Great Eruption, doesn't establish a body like Pseudo does, it doesn't establish a blocker like Rebecca does when it plays Hina. So you need another card to pair with Ice Age, and in doing so, that means your hand size went from whatever it was -2. And sometimes that's definitely worth it, especially if like this helps you deal with a Yamato or a 10 cost Big Mom in the Katakuri matchup, things like that that are generally a lot harder to reach, even opposing 10 cost Kaidos. But the reason I mentioned its card disadvantage is because you really can't afford to play like just 4 of it just because of how efficient its cost reduction is. Because eventually you would just end up losing to leader attacks because you wouldn't have any cards in your hand to defend them, even if you were removing everything that they had. So with that in mind, just consider maybe a 1 of or a 2 of. You don't really see decks with more than that, and that's the reason why Ice Age is an extremely powerful card, but it does come at a cost of lowering your hand size. So last on this list is Sanji's Pilaf, and Sanji's Pilaf fills the role of what Hina does, the 3 cost Hina, or rather the blue Hina that I talked about earlier in this video, of giving you a 3-Dawn play that's actually beneficial towards your game plan. Drawing cards is really nice for Sakazuki, digging towards the cards that you need and sculpting your hand, all things Sakazuki wants to be doing. And that's the strength of Sanji's Pilaf. The downside of it is it's not a body, it has no counter, it's not Navy, and even though it has a trigger, we're a 4-life leader, so hitting triggers isn't really one of our MOs, you know, that's not what we're going for. So all those things considered, it's definitely better than Hina is on higher Dawn turns. For example, like if you're playing this on 10 Dawn, drawing 2 and then maybe finding some pieces to catch you up. It's more than likely better than Hina establishing a 4K on turn on 10 Dawn and drawing only 1 card, and that's only if you have 5 or less. So it's definitely better there, but they both come with their pros and cons. Hina can be Hound Blazed, which is really nice. You can buff it to attack for 7. Sanji's Pilaf can't. Pilaf draws you 2 cards, Hina only draws you 1. So there's pros and cons to each of them. I don't think I would run the 2 in concert. Actually, maybe, if you want to split the difference and see if you get some success. I could see a world where you do that. But do consider that the only reason these cards are considered playing, the blue Hina and Sanji's Pilaf, is because of the desire to have that 3-Dawn play where you're not just relying on drawing brand new and attacking for 6. So whichever one you feel like you have more success with, or maybe one's more accessible to you, or you can just run neither of them like my list is. So lastly, I have just a short little list of cards here that I either have seen in lists or I could see people reasoning themselves into playing. And I kind of just want to go over the strengths and weaknesses of each one in case you currently have these in your deck and maybe I would want to convince you to not run it, or if you want to justify why you play it to people and maybe haven't been able to quite explain it. So Fukudo, he looks real nice and he's different than Borsalino in the sense that he can't be KO'd on any turn, so he can't be Red Hawked or Jet Pistoled or Thunderbolted, things like that. But the reason I assume and I would never play him is because he's not Navy, first of all, and he's not aggressive. And like I mentioned in the start of this video, Sakazuki wants to be controlling board but being proactive. You don't want to just play Hound Blazes on your leader and attacking for 8 and never having a board presence. And Fukudo is, as a 3K body, is pretty much just defensive. He's a great defensive tool, but we don't really need that, especially since we're going to be controlling board. Now, Ulti as a card, when it was previewed, was very hyped. I do think it's an amazing card. It's very playable in a lot of decks. I just don't know if this is the deck for it. Card advantage is nice, but if it was a 3 cost, it would be much better, even if it was like a 3 cost 3K, just to give us a play on turn 1 and help to set up our future turns. I think maybe we'd be playing it, but it's competing with a lot of cards in this slot. It's not Navy, it's competing with Kuzan, Borsalino, Rob Lucci, Rebecca, all these other 4-drops that we'd probably rather be playing, but I just don't think it's good enough to make the cut. Like I mentioned at the start of this video, there's just not a lot of room in Sakazuki to play with too many flex spots. So if you've been running Ulti because of how good it is in multicolor leaders, personally I would consider cutting it, but if it's been working well for you, hey, more power to you. Maybe you're taking good advantage of that card advantage and game plan sculpting. Next is Morgan, basically a budget Kuzan. He doesn't draw you the card and he reduces one list, but he has counter power, which is actually pretty relevant if you feel like you've been losing most of your matches because you just can't counter out of opponent's attacks. Maybe he's a card that you might want to consider. The -3 versus -4 isn't really that big of a deal. Reducing costs when we're starting with -3 is really not that big of a problem, and just being down the card advantage that Kuzan draws you is it's not nothing, it's pretty significant. But I definitely see Morgan as a viable substitute because in his worst case scenario he at least has counter power, and he's still recurable by Rebecca and still Navy. Now Virgo is a card that I personally was experimenting with. Maybe no one else was as crazy as I am to try it, but I liked the fact that he was a 2k searchable off brand new because he's Navy and recurable with Rebecca. Because unlike Toy Soldier and Sudu, you can get this back with Rebecca and have a 2k defensively and then just play a different card with Rebecca or don't play anything at all. So I experimented with him for 2. He actually worked quite a bit for me for a little while, but as my locals and the meta has gotten a little bit more competitive, people are more comfortable with their decks now. He's just not cutting it. At the end of the day, this would be basically a blank card that's just a 2k that you're only playing for its character type. So if you're considering running it and maybe you're as frustrated as I was when I was whiffing my brand news revealing 3 Dressrosa cards, maybe this is a card you might want to consider. Next up is Zeph. Zeph is an extremely efficient tempo play in a lot of situations. Of course, one of the biggest weaknesses of running it is another card that's not Navy would make your count of non-Navy cards, even higher, making your brand news whiff more. And of course, returning to hand is just not the same as bottom decking or KOing. This card is especially good against cards like Perospero, so if your local is full of Katakuris or something, maybe this is worth running. But other than that, probably just not worth the tempo. It is nice to establish a body, but in most matchups it'll just die anyway. And it's not like it's a 5-7, it's a 5-6, which is a great stat line, but we can do better. Like for example, we'd be competing with Sabo at this stat line, or even Rob Lucci for 1 less Dawn, meaning we had 1 more Dawn to use to reduce costs. So if you like Zeph and if you can find the room for him, go for it. But other than that, there's not the most incentive to play him. So next up is X-Drake, and X-Drake looks really nice. I mean, he kind of does so much. He's a blocker, a 6k, he could attack aggressively, defend aggressively, he sets up our next couple of turns, and he's even Navy, which is really nice because he'd be searchable off brand new. Problem is, in this meta, you don't expect him to really stick around too long. He can get things like Katakuri, Yamato'd, 9-cost Kaido'd, and then Sakazuki, a whole mess of things. And he also doesn't provide towards our game plan of reducing or removing. He's just a really efficient blocker. So as much as he might look like it, it doesn't really look like he's for this deck. And if you've been running him because he's just a really solid card, I don't blame you, but I'd consider maybe taking it out and looking for other options. The next up is Sogeking, another card that might look like it's really good, and honestly probably isn't that bad. With leader effect, attacking and reducing a 7 cost and then bouncing it back to the hand might actually be good, but most of the 7s that we'd be bouncing are probably not ones that our opponent would have too much trouble just playing down again, like Ace or Big Mom. And he does draw 2 cards, does discard 2 cards to fill up the trash, does have counter power, all around a really solid card, especially if right now like one of your biggest problems is budget in building Sakazuki. I could totally see Sogeking filling in some holes, but at the end of the day, once you get like a more stock list ready, I don't think he's good enough to play. He's also, again, non-Navy, so you would add to that count. So just something to consider. Next up is the 10-cost Kaido that came out in the previous set in OP04. I initially experimented with this card because I thought it was an extremely powerful way to break serve in this deck. Like, if I'm behind, if my opponent has 3 characters and I have 0, playing a 10-cost Kaido, like bouncing back, let's say, like a Katakuri and a Ohm or something like that, just in 1 turn while establishing a 12k, that can't be dealt with the Katakuri that I just bounced or anything like that. It sounded really good, and in theory it probably is. And again, like if you feel like you're wanting to build like a budget version of Sakazuki, then this might be one of your top end cards that you might want to consider. Honestly, really powerful. It's just that in situations where like it's one of your only plays and the thing threatening you might be their leader, it's just doesn't shine as well. as the other 10 cost Kaido does, because at the very least the other 10 cost Kaido draws you 4 cards, which could theoretically be maybe like 2 2Ks or a 2K and a 1K, or things that you're going to establish next turn to not lose. It's just really complicated trying to find the space for him, but in all honesty, not a bad card at all. Next up is Barrier, a really interesting card, something that probably no one would ever see coming if you were playing it, and could be like a huge blowout. It's really easy to get 15 cards in the graveyard with Sakazuki and get that 4K, and there's not a blue one right now, like a blue version of Radical Beam or Elthor, so Sakazuki does have the option of playing this, but mainly Sakazuki's best defensive plan is usually to just deal with the board so that you don't have to counter high, and you could just block high attacks with things like Rebecca or Borsellino or Sabo. Still though, if you want to run like a 1 of or 2 of, definitely not a bad card, definitely playable, and could definitely steal you some games, maybe for a local or 2 before people start playing around it. And then maybe if you show up to locals with one, win a couple, and then take it out, people will keep playing around it, thinking that you still have it. So if you want to play the long con, something worth considering. Next is 3000 Worlds, probably the most playable of all the cards that I've put here on the list. It's just extremely efficient, extremely powerful. With just one of your other reducers, deals with almost everything in the game because it has that range of 5 or less. Its only real problem, I guess there's 3. 1, no counter, obviously, right? 2, it's not Navy, so brand new can't search it and you can't recur it or anything like that. So in spots where you need it but need to dig for it, obviously brand new can't. And then 3, it's a little bit off game plan. I've mentioned several times in this video that the real game plan of Sakazuki is to be proactive with our removal. And while 3000 Worlds is great at dealing with a lot of the things threatening us, it doesn't present a threat back to our opponent. You know, our opponent gets to untap, and if they have more threats to follow up with, they're not under any pressure where, oh, like maybe I have to take a turn off to play a blocker or to deal with what's on board, or, you know, 3000 Worlds takes 4 of your Dawn to deal with, albeit like a really powerful threat probably, but it doesn't establish one of its own, and that's its really biggest weakness. Next is Red Rock. Basically a lot of the same reasons as 3000 Worlds. It deals with everything, but you pretty much can't ever establish another threat with this. In the best case scenario, you're maybe playing Red Rock plus Borsellino, or Red Rock plus Rebecca put in Hina or something like that, which are very powerful plays, but those are the best case scenarios. Otherwise, like if you're tapping out and just using the rest of your Dawn to attack, it might not be proactive enough if your opponent has been controlling your board very well in the same way. Again, not Navy, not searchable, no counter. Its trigger isn't exactly the strongest, so if you want to run some, if you feel like you're running into a lot of 10 cost big moms or something like that and you can't reduce them, maybe it's worth running. But actually I feel like this card is even worse against 10 cost big mom, because if you're going to beat Katakuris at all, it's through establishing early pressure to where you can beat them even past the 10 cost big mom, as long as they don't get lucky with their triggers. And not deploying a threat, getting rid of their big mom, just allowing them to maybe play another one, and maybe didn't even take a life that turn. It's just not the best place for it. So lastly, I want to talk about Navy HQ. It's an interesting card. It's actually really powerful, both on play and the activation to just get you that 1 extra cost. The biggest problem is just that you really only want it on 1 Dawn, or maybe 3 Dawn, and after that it can get clunky in your hand. Like, yes, you can use it to play, but you might end up needing to pitch it to leader effect anyway, in which case, like, why is it in your deck? Sometimes the 1 isn't needed, and so like you're just there wondering like, well, why did I even have it? I'm down a card because I had to play it from my hand and it didn't replace itself. It has no counter, and ultimately it does what our leader does, so probably don't really need to be playing with it. But if you feel like your version of Sakazuki is maybe on less reducers, more KOs, and you want to run something like Navy HQ, by all means you can try it out, maybe as a 1 or 2 of, and if you're enjoying it, just keep playing it. So guys, that was the Sakazuki breakdown. On screen you'll see my current list of Sakazuki. I'm always changing and editing my list to look different pretty much every single week, and I expect it to keep changing. I always adapt it towards my local meta and towards the players I consider to be the best at my locals, what they're on, and just in general fitting my playstyle. So if you learned anything from this vid, it is that you do not have to run exactly what I'm running. I'm not saying this is the cracked code of what's best in the meta right now. If you're trying to build towards a specific meta, like your locals, or let's say a regional where most people will be on Enel or most people will be on Luffy, different things like that, like there should always be a way that you're building Sakazuki to play into that meta. And just in general, like I mentioned at the start of this video, you should build a Sakazuki that fits your playstyle. If you like to play the long game, you like more tempo plays, more aggressive plays, there's all these cards that you can consider that fit that mold. So I hope you guys learned something. I hope you liked the video. I hope it was informative to you. There's definitely so much more I could say about every single one of these cards and all of its small use cases. And if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below, and I'd be happy to answer them. But otherwise, look forward to some gameplay of Sakazuki in the future. I'll hope to be posting some of its harder matchups and some of what I like to do to win those matchups later on in the week, maybe next week. And just keep an eye out for those. Hopefully you learned something. And lastly, I do want to mention that I know the One Piece card game is not in the most accessible place right now. Cards like Borsalino, the 4 cost, are really gatekeeping people from playing this deck, and I definitely feel for that, and I hope things change, but I really hope that it doesn't discourage you from playing. You can still play a lot of other fun decks that are a little less expensive, hopefully, or at the very least, I want to believe in One Piece enough to say that it's a card game worth investing in. Like, let's say you do drop the money for Borsalinos. At least, hopefully, you'll be, in a nice place knowing that they're going to be worth playing for the foreseeable future. It's like a really good card. It's seeing play in OP06 as we've seen in Perona and Gecko Moria, and I don't imagine it'll stop seeing play, so hopefully, what I'm trying to say is try not to be discouraged, especially by the money. Hopefully your community is very helpful and supportive and tries to do their best to always encourage new players to be playing. And in the biggest sense, I hope Bandai does something about this issue of buyouts and price gouging that is happening. I hope, even if Japan doesn't need one, they'll do a reprint set for us to make things more accessible, because I really do love this card game and I don't want it to be killed by toxic moves like people over-investing or being gatekept from playing the game by driving prices up. So anyway, sorry about that little rant. It's just a little personal opinion at the current climate of the, One Piece TCG world. But anyway, again, like, comment, subscribe. Please let me know any of your thoughts. If I missed anything, please feel free to say, leave it for other people to keep continuing to grow and keep continuing to learn. And as always, have a Rio Grande.